Her gaze may have been angled slightly differently. The landscape behind her evolved as Leonardo modified the horizon lines, adjusted the positions of mountains and water. The painting we see now is the result of countless decisions, each one bringing the image closer to whatever ideal Leonardo was pursuing, each adjustment creating new harmonies and relationships between the elements. The panel itself, poplar wood, about 30 by 21 inches, is remarkably small for a painting of such monumental reputation. You can stand before it in the Louvre and be surprised by its dimensions, by how such a small object can contain such presence and power. But size has nothing to do with impact, and Leonardo knew this. He was creating not a display piece designed to dominate a wall, but an intimate object meant for close viewing, for sustained contemplation. The painting invites you to lean in, to study the details, to lose yourself in the subtle gradations of tone and the hypnotic quality of that gaze that seems to follow you, to acknowledge your presence, to engage in silent dialogue across the centuries. What makes the Mona Lisa truly extraordinary is not any single element, but the way everything works together to create an effect greater than the sum of its parts. The composition guides your eye through the painting, from the face to the hands, out to the landscape, back to the face again, in a continuous loop that keeps you engaged, that rewards repeated viewing with new discoveries. The colors, though muted now by centuries of aging varnish, are perfectly harmonized, with the warm tones of the flesh balanced against the cooler tones of the landscape, the darks providing structure and depth without becoming oppressive. The light seems to come from everywhere and nowhere, suffusing the image with a soft glow that eliminates harsh contrasts while maintaining clear definition. And then there is the ineffable quality, the thing that cannot be analyzed or explained, the sense that you are not looking at paint on wood, but at an actual person, a consciousness looking back at you. Leonardo had achieved what every portrait painter attempts. He had captured not just appearance, but presence, not just what Lisa looked like, but something of who she was. Or perhaps, more accurately, he had created an image that seemed so alive, so psychologically complex, that viewers could project onto it their own ideas about who this woman might be, what she might be thinking, what that smile might mean. The painting became, in Leonardo's hands, a kind of mirror. Each viewer saw something different in that enigmatic expression, brought their own expectations and emotions to the encounter, completed the image through interpretation. A melancholy person might see sadness in the smile. Someone happy might see contentment. A cynic might see mockery or condescension. A romantic might see tenderness. The painting contained all these possibilities and none of them definitively, remaining perpetually open to interpretation, eternally ambiguous. Leonardo never sold the painting, never delivered it to Francesco del Giocondo, never parted with it voluntarily. It traveled with him from Florence to Milan in 1506 or thereabouts, when he returned to serve the French governor who now controlled the city. It went with him to Rome in 1513, when he sought employment from the new Medici Pope. And it accompanied him to France in 1516, when King Francis I invited him to spend his final years at the French court. The painting had become inseparable from Leonardo himself, both a creation and a companion, something he could work on whenever inspiration struck, whenever he felt the urge to refine just one more detail, to add one more translucent layer, to bring it infinitesimally closer to perfection. In France, during Leonardo's final years, visitors to his lodgings reported seeing the painting in his possession. Antonio de Bedi's, secretary to Cardinal Luigi of Aragon, visited Leonardo in 1517 and recorded seeing 3 paintings in the old master's studio, one of which was described as a certain Florentine lady done from life at the request of the late magnificent Giuliano de' Medici. This may have been the Mona Lisa, though the reference to Giuliano de' Medici rather than Francesco del Giocondo has created confusion among scholars. Perhaps Leonardo had painted more than one portrait that resembled the Mona Lisa. Perhaps the secretary's notes were inaccurate. Or perhaps Leonardo, in his old age, had reconstructed the history of the painting in his own mind, attributing it to a more illustrious patron than a silk merchant. What is certain is that after Leonardo's death in 1519, the painting entered the French royal collection, probably purchased directly from Leonardo's estate by King Francis I for the substantial sum of 4,000 écus. It remained in royal hands for centuries, moving from palace to palace, admired by those with access to the royal collections, but largely unknown to the general public. During the French Revolution, it was briefly displayed in the Louvre, which had been transformed from a royal palace into a public museum. Napoleon later moved it to his private quarters, hanging it in his bedroom, before it was returned to the Louvre, where it has remained, with a few brief exceptions, ever since. For centuries, the Mona Lisa was admired primarily by artists and connoisseurs, people with the knowledge to appreciate Leonardo's technical innovations and the subtlety of his approach. It was considered a masterpiece, certainly, but not necessarily more important than many other Renaissance paintings. Its fame was professional rather than popular, contained within the art world rather than spreading into broader culture. That would change dramatically in the 19th century, when Romantic poets and writers began to see in the painting something more than technical excellence, something mysterious and even slightly sinister. The French poet Théophile Gautier wrote about the painting in the 1850s, describing Lisa as having the smile of voluptuousness, the smile of mystery, the smile one might say of the Sphinx. This interpretation, emphasizing mystery and psychological depth over technical mastery, resonated with Romantic sensibilities. The Mona Lisa became, in the hands of these writers, a symbol of feminine mystery, of the eternal enigma of womanhood, of secrets hidden behind beautiful surfaces. The British critic Walter Potter wrote an extraordinarily influential passage about the painting, describing it in prose so purple and overwrought that it became almost as famous as the painting itself, calling her older than the rocks among which she sits, suggesting she had lived countless lives and embodied all of human experience. These interpretations, however fanciful, transformed the painting from an admired artwork into a cultural phenomenon. People began visiting the Louvre specifically to see the Mona Lisa, to experience for themselves this mysterious woman who had captured the Romantic imagination. The painting began to be reproduced, first in engravings and later in photographs, spreading its image beyond those who could travel to Paris. It became an icon, recognizable even to people who knew nothing else about art, a symbol of Western culture and of the Renaissance itself. And then, in 1911, the Mona Lisa became truly famous in the modern sense, not just admired, but notorious through an act of theft. On August 21st, an Italian handyman named Vincenzo Perugia, who had worked at the Louvre installing protective glass over paintings, walked into the museum during regular hours, lifted the Mona Lisa off the wall, hid it under his coat, and walked out. The painting was not discovered missing until the next day, and the theft sparked an international sensation. Newspapers around the world ran front-page stories. The French government was embarrassed. The police launched a massive investigation. Even Pablo Picasso was briefly questioned as a suspect. The painting remained missing for 2 years, during which time its fame grew exponentially. People who had never thought about the Mona Lisa suddenly cared deeply about its recovery. Conspiracy theories proliferated. Some believed it had been destroyed. Others thought it had been stolen to order for a private collector. The empty space on the Louvre wall where it had hung became a pilgrimage site, with visitors coming to stare at the blank spot as though the absence itself had power. The theft demonstrated something profound about fame and value that the story surrounding an artwork could amplify its importance, that notoriety could transform appreciation into obsession. When Perugia was finally caught in 1913 trying to sell the painting to a gallery in Florence, believing, bizarrely, that he was returning it to its rightful home in Italy, the recovery became another international event. The Mona Lisa toured Italy before being returned to France, and everywhere it appeared, massive crowds gathered to see it. It returned to the Louvre in January 1914, greeted by tens of thousands of people who lined the streets as though welcoming home a beloved prisoner of war. The painting that Leonardo had worked on in relative obscurity, that had hung in royal collections accessible only to the privileged few, had become public property in a new sense. It belonged to the world, to everyone, its image and story woven into collective consciousness. In the century since, the Mona Lisa's fame has only grown, amplified by reproduction and parody, by its appearance in popular culture, by the millions of tourists who visit the Louvre primarily to see it. The painting now hangs behind bulletproof glass in its own climate-controlled room, protected from the damage that light and humidity and human breath could cause. Visitors line up for hours, shuffle past in crowds, snap photos with their phones, often spending mere seconds actually looking at the painting before moving on. The experience of seeing the Mona Lisa in person has become less about contemplating Leonardo's artistry than about confirming that you have been there, that you have seen the most famous painting in the world. Yet despite this transformation into spectacle, despite the layers of fame and mythology that now obscure it, the painting itself remains extraordinary. If you can look past the crowds and the cultural baggage, if you can see it with fresh eyes, it still demonstrates everything Leonardo achieved at his best. The technical mastery is absolute. 5 centuries of artists have studied it and learned from it, and it still has lessons to teach about subtlety, about patience, about the possibilities of paint. The psychological depth is genuine, that sense of presence, of a person existing behind a painted surface, was not created by romantic writers projecting onto the image, but by Leonardo's profound understanding of what makes us recognize humanity in arranged pigments. The painting has survived remarkably well, though not perfectly. The colors have darkened somewhat as the varnish aged. The poplar paddle has warped slightly, causing a small crack that has been carefully stabilized. There is some crackler, the fine network of cracks that appears in old paintings as the paint ages and becomes brittle, though this is minimal compared to many works from the same period. Conservation efforts have been careful and conservative, preserving Leonardo's work without attempting to improve it through aggressive restoration. The painting we see today is as close as possible to what Leonardo created, allowing for the inevitable changes that 500 years inevitably bring. Scientific analysis continues to reveal new information about Leonardo's techniques. Infrared imaging shows the underdrawing beneath the paint, revealing how Leonardo established his composition. X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy identifies the specific pigments he used: lead white, vermilion, azurite, earth pigments, and shows how he mixed them to achieve particular effects. Microscopic examination of paint samples reveals the extraordinary thinness of individual layers, confirming that Leonardo built up the image through dozens or even hundreds of applications, each one almost transparent, their cumulative effect creating the luminosity and depth that make the painting seem to glow from within. Modern viewers sometimes struggle to understand what makes the Mona Lisa special, why this particular painting, among all the masterpieces in the world, has achieved such unprecedented fame. Standing in the crowded room at the Louvre, jostling for position among tourists taking selfies, the painting can seem almost disappointing, smaller than expected, darker than reproductions suggest, obscured by reflections on the protective glass. The experience rarely matches the expectations built by centuries of reputation. Yet this disconnect itself reveals something important about how art works, how meaning accumulates, how technical achievement transforms into cultural phenomenon. The painting Leonardo created was revolutionary in its time, introducing techniques and approaches that would influence generations of artists. The sfumato, the psychological complexity, the sense of a specific individual rather than a generic type, these were innovations that changed what portraiture could be, what painting could achieve. But Leonardo could not have predicted that this particular work would become the most famous painting in history. Fame on that scale requires not just excellence, but circumstance, the accumulation of stories and associations that transform an artwork into something larger than itself. The Mona Lisa became a symbol of the Renaissance, of human genius, of Western culture, of art itself. It became a mirror in which each era saw its own preoccupations reflected back. The Romantics saw mystery and eternal feminine enigma. The Surrealists, particularly Duchamp with his famous mustachioed parody, saw something to rebel against, an icon so sacred that defacing it became a revolutionary act. Pop artists like Andy Warhol reproduced it endlessly, using its ubiquity to comment on fame and commodification. Contemporary digital artists manipulate it in infinite variations, exploring what happens when the most famous face in art enters the age of artificial intelligence and deepfakes. Yet, beneath all these layers of interpretation and appropriation, the original painting remains a wooden panel covered with pigments that Leonardo applied with careful deliberation, building up an image of a Florentine merchant's wife who sat for him more than 500 years ago. Lisa Gherardini lived to be 63, dying in 1542 at a convent in Florence, where she had retired after her husband's death. She never saw what her portrait would become, never imagined that her face would be recognized by billions of people across centuries and continents, that school children in countries that did not exist in her lifetime would know her smile. Leonardo, too, could not have fully grasped the painting's future significance, though he clearly knew he had achieved something remarkable. He kept it with him because he believed it represented his best work, his most complete realization of what painting could be. He continued refining it because his perfectionism would not allow him to consider any work truly finished, because he always saw possibilities for improvement, for one more layer that would bring it infinitesimally closer to the ideal in his mind. The Mona Lisa was his companion through his wandering final years, a constant in a life of constant change, a reminder of what he could achieve when all his knowledge and skill and vision aligned. The painting is also a testament to patience, to the value of taking time, of refusing to rush toward completion. In an age that increasingly values speed and efficiency, that celebrates rapid production and quick results, the Mona Lisa stands as evidence that some achievements require slowness, That building up depth and complexity through countless layers takes time that cannot be compressed or shortcut. Leonardo worked on the painting for perhaps 15 years or more, returning to it again and again, never satisfied, always seeing room for refinement. That patience, that refusal to accept good enough when excellence remained possible, is part of what makes the painting extraordinary. But there is also something poignant about Leonardo's relationship with the Mona Lisa, something that reveals the cost of his perfectionism. He never delivered the painting to the person who commissioned it, never received payment for years of work, never moved on to the next project with the satisfaction of completion. The painting represented not just achievement, but also the incompleteness that haunted him throughout his life, the gap between vision and execution that he could never quite close. Every layer he added made the painting better, but it also revealed new possibilities for improvement, new subtleties that could be explored, new refinements that could be attempted. The pursuit of perfection became a trap, making completion impossible because there was always one more adjustment to make, one more detail to refine. This tension between achievement and incompletion defined Leonardo's career. He created some of the most influential artworks in history, yet he left more projects unfinished than finished, disappointed more patrons than he satisfied, promised more than he could deliver. The Mona Lisa became his masterpiece partly because he never had to declare it finished, never had to hand it over, and accept that no further improvement was possible. It remained perpetually in progress, a meditation rather than a product, a question rather than answer. In his final years in France, Leonardo's hands began to fail him. Medical historians examining contemporary accounts have suggested he suffered a stroke that paralyzed his right hand, though since he was left-handed, this may not have prevented him from continuing to paint. But his energy was fading, his health declining, and the endless curiosity that had driven him to investigate everything was finally running up against the limitations of mortality. He could still think, could still observe, could still fill notebooks with ideas. But the body that had served him for nearly 70 years was wearing out, reminding him that even genius could not transcend the physical facts of existence. Yet the Mona Lisa would endure long after Leonardo's hand could no longer hold a brush, long after the man who created it had dissolved into dust and legend. The painting became his immortality, the most complete answer he could give to the question of what painting could achieve when practiced at the absolute pinnacle of human capability. It demonstrated that art was not mere decoration or illustration, but a way of knowing, a method of investigation as rigorous and revealing as any science, capable of capturing truths about human experience that could not be expressed in any other form. Lisa Gherardini's face, transformed through Leonardo's genius into the Mona Lisa, became a bridge across time, connecting the Renaissance to the present, linking Leonardo's hand to the billions of eyes that have gazed at the painting over the centuries. She sits there still in the Louvre, behind her protective glass, surrounded by crowds and cameras, wearing that enigmatic expression that has generated libraries of interpretation. She has witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the transformation of art from the privilege of elites to the right of all people, the invention of technologies Leonardo could not have imagined. And she continues to smile, slightly, mysteriously, as though she knows something we do not, as though Leonardo embedded in her painted surface secrets that 500 years have not exhausted. The Mona Lisa is not just Leonardo's final masterpiece, but his most complete statement, a summation of everything he learned about seeing, about painting, about the mystery of human consciousness. It is the culmination of his wandering path from the hills of Vinci, through the workshops of Florence and the courts of Milan and Rome, through thousands of pages of notebooks and hundreds of investigations into how the world worked. All of it, the anatomical studies, the optical experiments, the observations of water and air and light, the endless questioning and refusing to accept conventional wisdom, all of it poured into this single image of a woman who lived an ordinary life, but whose face became extraordinary through the alchemy of genius. And so, as the crowds continue to gather, as the cameras continue to flash, as the painting continues its impossible existence as both priceless artwork and ubiquitous icon, it carries within it the presence of Leonardo himself, his patience, his curiosity, his refusal to compromise, his belief that understanding the world required looking deeper than surface appearance, his conviction that beauty and truth were not separate but intertwined, his demonstration that a human mind, properly applied, could create something that would speak across centuries, that would remain perpetually alive, perpetually new, perpetually capable of surprising and moving those who truly looked. Chapter 6: The Last Years in France. The journey across the Alps in the autumn of 1516 must have been difficult for a man of 64, even one carried in a comfortable litter rather than forced to walk or ride. Leonardo da Vinci, his body weakening but his mind still alert, traveled from Rome through the mountains toward France, accepting an invitation that promised something he had rarely known in his long, restless life: security without obligation, respect without condition, freedom without the pressure of constant production. King Francis I, young and ambitious and enamored of Italian culture, had offered Leonardo a position as first painter, engineer, and architect to the king, but this was more honorary title than job description. The king wanted Leonardo not for what he could produce, but for who he was, wanted the prestige of hosting one of the great geniuses of the age, wanted conversations and ideas more than finished paintings or completed projects. Leonardo traveled with a small household, his faithful companion Francesco Melzi, a young nobleman who had been his student and assistant for more than a decade. Salai, the beautiful, troublesome boy he had taken in decades earlier, who was now a middle-aged man. And a few servants. He brought with him the tools of his trade and the accumulations of a lifetime: notebooks by the hundreds, drawings by the thousands, and 3 paintings he considered his finest work and had never sold. The Mona Lisa, a painting of Saint Anne with the Virgin and Infant Christ, and a portrait of John the Baptist. These paintings were his companions, his meditation objects, works he had refined over years or decades, never quite finishing because finishing would mean accepting that no further improvement was possible. The Alps in autumn were beautiful and treacherous, the high passes already touched with early snow, the paths winding through landscapes of stone and sky that Leonardo's notebooks had prepared him to read like text. He had studied mountains, understood how they formed, how weather shaped them, how water carved through rock over geological ages. Even in his weakened state, even as an old man being carried toward what he must have known would be his final home, his eyes remained active, observing, recording, seeing patterns and principles in everything. The mind that had spent 7 decades investigating the world would not stop now simply because the body was failing. They descended from the mountains into the Loire Valley, that gentle landscape of rivers and forests where French kings had built their chateaux, those elaborate palaces that combined defensive architecture with Renaissance elegance. Francis I maintained his court at Amboise, a massive castle perched above the Loire River, its towers and battlements speaking of medieval power, while its newer sections embraced the artistic sophistication that Francis admired in Italy. And near the castle, connected to it by an underground passage, stood the Château de Clou, a smaller but gracious manor house that Francis granted to Leonardo for his personal use, rent-free for as long as he lived. The chateau was perfect for Leonardo's needs, large enough to accommodate his household and provide working space, comfortable without being ostentatious, surrounded by gardens where he could walk and observe nature, close enough to the royal court that Francis could visit whenever he wished to converse with his honored guest. Leonardo settled into this new home with the relief of someone who had finally stopped running, who had found a place where he could simply be rather than constantly proving his worth, constantly seeking the next commission, constantly moving to stay ahead of political upheaval or professional disappointment. Francis, I was 22 years old when Leonardo arrived, young enough to be the artist's grandson, yet the two formed a relationship of genuine mutual affection. Francis had been raised to appreciate art and learning, had cultivated himself as a Renaissance prince should, and he recognized in Leonardo not just a famous artist, but a universal mind, someone who could discuss anything from painting to engineering, to philosophy to natural science. The king visited Leonardo frequently, sometimes arriving through the underground passage that connected the royal chateau to Leonardo's manor, sitting with the old master for hours, listening to his stories, his observations, his ideas about everything under the sun. Leonardo, who had spent decades navigating the dangerous waters of court politics, who had learned to be careful with patrons, to manage their expectations while protecting his own independence, found in Francis something different, a patron who asked for nothing specific, who valued his presence more than his production, who treated him more like a revered teacher than a hired craftsman. It was perhaps the first time since his youth in Verrocchio's workshop that Leonardo felt fully safe, fully appreciated for who he was rather than for what he could deliver. Yet even in this comfortable refuge, Leonardo could not entirely stop working. His hands, damaged by what was probably a stroke, could no longer paint with the precision he demanded of himself. Contemporary accounts mention that his right hand was paralyzed, though as a left-hander he might still have been able to work. But whether the limitation was physical or psychological, the devastating realization that his hand could no longer execute what his eye could see, Leonardo painted little or nothing during his French years. The 3 paintings he had brought with him remained with him, but if he continued refining them, it was with additions so subtle that we cannot detect them now. Instead, he turned his energy toward design and planning, toward the kinds of projects that required vision and calculation rather than manual execution. Francis consulted him about various schemes, a palace that would surpass anything yet built, a canal system that would make the Loire more navigable, a new city designed from first principles to be both beautiful and functional. Leonardo responded with ideas, with drawings, with plans that showed his imagination remained as fertile as ever, even if his body could no longer fully realize his visions. He designed a mechanical lion for a royal celebration, a device that could walk forward, then open its chest to reveal Lily, the symbol of French royalty, a piece of theatrical engineering that delighted Francis and demonstrated that Leonardo's ability to merge art with mechanics had not diminished. The manor house at Clou later, known as Clos Luz, became Leonardo's final workshop. Though it was quieter than any he had occupied before, less frantic with the demands of multiple commissions and impatient patrons. Here, surrounded by his notebooks and drawings, attended by Melzi, who served him with devotion that went beyond duty, Leonardo spent his final years in a kind of suspended autumn, still thinking, still observing, but with the urgency gradually fading, replaced by reflection and consolidation. He was no longer racing toward some future achievement, but looking back over the extraordinary distance he had traveled, the thousands of investigations he had pursued, the paintings he had created, and the many more he had left unfinished. He organized his papers with Melzi's help, trying to impose some order on the chaos of decades of note-taking. Melzi understood the value of what Leonardo had accumulated, recognized these notebooks contained insights and discoveries that the world had not yet appreciated, that should not be lost when their creator died. Leonardo had always intended to write proper treatises on painting, on anatomy, on water, on mechanics, organizing his scattered observations into systematic presentations that could be published and studied. But that work required energy and concentration that he no longer possessed, required a belief in the future that was harder to maintain as his own future contracted to months, then weeks. Yet even in decline, Leonardo received visitors who sought him out as one of the great figures of the age. In October 1517, Cardinal Luigi of Aragon visited with his secretary, Antonio de Betis, who recorded the encounter in his diary. De Betis described Leonardo as an old man of more than 70. He was actually 65, who had suffered paralysis of the right hand and could no longer paint, though he could still draw and teach. Leonardo showed his visitors 3 paintings, including what was probably the Mona Lisa, and an extraordinary collection of anatomical drawings based on dissections of more than 30 bodies, drawings that the secretary described as both skillful and potentially useful to medical science. The cardinal's party also heard from Leonardo himself about his various investigations and inventions. Even at this late stage, even with his strength failing, Leonardo was eager to share what he had learned, to explain his ideas about how the world worked, to demonstrate the connections he had found between seemingly unrelated phenomena. The visitors came away impressed, but also perhaps slightly puzzled, sensing that they had been in the presence of genius but not fully grasping the scope of what Leonardo had achieved. His knowledge was too broad, too interdisciplinary, too far ahead of what others in his era could comprehend. He was, as he had been throughout his life, a man out of time, more compatible with future centuries than with his own. Francis I valued him precisely for this quality. The young king understood, perhaps intuitively rather than intellectually, that Leonardo represented something extraordinary, that hosting him added luster to the French court in ways that went beyond what could be measured. When courtiers questioned why the king paid Leonardo a generous pension without receiving paintings or sculptures in return, Francis reportedly said that Leonardo had reached an age where he should be honored for what he had already achieved, that his presence and his conversation were worth more than any work he might produce. This was unusual patronage for the Renaissance, when artists were typically valued for their output rather than for themselves, when even the most celebrated painters and sculptors were expected to deliver products in exchange for payment. In the gardens surrounding the manor house, Leonardo could still walk when his strength permitted, observing the plants and trees, watching how light changed through the hours and seasons, noting how water flowed in the streams and fountains. These observations, which had occupied him since childhood, continued to provide pleasure and insight. Nature remained endlessly fascinating, endlessly generous with lessons for those who knew how to look. He had spent his life learning to see, developing an attention so refined that he noticed patterns others missed, relationships others never suspected. That ability had not deserted him, even if the body that housed it was gradually failing. He thought about water, which had always fascinated him above all other natural phenomena. Water shaped the earth, sustained all life, moved in patterns of extraordinary complexity and beauty. He had studied it for decades, drawn it in countless variations, tried to understand the mathematics of waves and currents, the physics of flow and resistance. In France, he proposed ambitious hydraulic projects, canals that would connect rivers, systems that would drain marshlands and make them cultivable, networks that would facilitate commerce and transportation. Some of these schemes were practical, others probably impossible given the technology of the time, but all demonstrated Leonardo's continued engagement with engineering problems, his belief that human ingenuity could reshape nature to human benefit. His relationship with Salai had evolved over the decades from the master-student dynamic of their early years to something more like equals, bound by history and affection despite Salai's continuing tendency toward mischief and self-interest. Sai had remained with Leonardo through all the wandering years, through Milan and Florence and Rome, benefiting from his master's generosity, occasionally stealing from him, painted by him in several works, modeling for him, caring for him, but also exploiting him. When Leonardo made his will in 1518, he left Salai several paintings and some property, acknowledging the complicated bond between them, the relationship that defied simple categorization as either professional or personal, but contained elements of both. Melzi, by contrast, was pure devotion. The young nobleman had attached himself to Leonardo in Milan around 1506, drawn by admiration for the master's genius, and had remained faithfully by his side ever since. Where Salai was beautiful but unreliable, Melzi was steady and intelligent, someone Leonardo could trust to understand his work, to help organize his papers, to preserve his legacy. In his will, Leonardo left Melzi his books, his instruments, his drawings, the intellectual inheritance, the accumulation of a lifetime of investigation. It was to Melzi that fell the responsibility of trying to make sense of the thousands of manuscript pages, of attempting to organize them into some publishable form, a task that would occupy Melzi for decades after Leonardo's death. The seasons turned. Autumn became winter. Winter yielded to spring. Leonardo's strength continued to ebb. The vital energy that had driven him through nearly 7 decades of ceaseless activity gradually running, down like a spring unwinding, like a candle burning toward its end. He spent more time in bed, less time walking in the gardens, more time in quiet reflection, less time actively working. The mind that had never stopped questioning, never stopped seeking to understand, began to turn inward, to contemplate not the mechanics of the external world, but the mystery of its own dissolution, the final transformation that awaited every living thing. In the spring of 1519, Leonardo's health deteriorated rapidly. The body that had carried him through so many miles, through so many investigations, that had climbed scaffolding to paint the Last Supper, that had dissected corpses in cold rooms, that had walked the hills of Tuscany as a boy and crossed the Alps as an old man, that body was shutting down, its systems failing one by one. He was confined to bed most of the time now, attended by Melzi and servants, visited by the king when affairs of state permitted, drifting between wakefulness and sleep, between the present and memory, between this world and whatever lay beyond. On April 23rd, sensing that the end was near, Leonardo summoned a priest and made his final confession, receiving the sacraments of the Church. For a man whose investigations had sometimes strayed into areas the Church viewed with suspicion, whose anatomical dissections could have brought accusations of sacrilege, whose scientific observations sometimes contradicted Scripture, this final reconciliation with religious authority was both conventional and perhaps necessary. Leonardo had never been openly heretical, had always moved carefully around doctrinal issues, and now, at the end, he followed the forms that society expected, making his peace with God according to the rituals of Catholic Christianity. His will, drawn up shortly before his death, distributed his possessions with care and precision. To Francesco Melzi went the notebooks and drawings, the instruments and books, everything that represented Leonardo's intellectual life, his investigations, his accumulated knowledge. This was the most valuable bequest, though its monetary worth was negligible compared to its historical and scientific significance. Leonardo trusted Melzi to preserve these materials, to attempt to organize them into publishable form, to ensure that his life's work would not simply disappear. To Salai and another servant went paintings and property material wealth that could be converted into money. That represented Leonardo's success as an artist, even if that success had always been complicated by his inability to complete projects on schedule. To his half-brothers in Florence, with whom he had maintained distant, but not hostile relations, went property in Italy. To his servants went money and clothing, provisions for their futures now that their master would no longer require their services. The will was precise, carefully considered, showing that even in weakness, Leonardo's mind remained clear, capable of practical judgment and equitable distribution. As April moved toward May, as spring flowers bloomed in the gardens he could no longer walk through, Leonardo's condition worsened. He was dying, and he knew it, and those around him knew it. Melzi wrote to Leonardo's half-brothers informing them of the impending death, describing Leonardo as the best father to him, expressing grief that was clearly genuine and profound. The letter reveals the emotional bonds that Leonardo had formed despite his general reserve. The way he had inspired not just admiration but love in those closest to him. A legend grew up around Leonardo's death, recorded by Vasari in his Lives of the Artists several decades later. According to this account, King Francis I was present at Leonardo's deathbed, and Leonardo died in the king's arms, supported by the young monarch who had honored him so generously during his final years. It is a beautiful story, the old genius dying in the embrace of royal patronage, receiving the ultimate acknowledgement of his worth. But it is almost certainly untrue. Court records show that Francis I was elsewhere on the day Leonardo died, attending to affairs of state in another city. The king could not have been present, though he may well have wished to be, may have felt genuine grief when news of Leonardo's death reached him. The truth, less poetic but perhaps more appropriate, is that Leonardo died attended by Melzi and his household, quietly slipping away in the manor house that had been his final refuge. He died on May 2, 1519, at the age of 67, neither young nor particularly old by the standards of his era, having outlived many of his contemporaries, but dying before completing all he might have accomplished with another decade or two. His death was quiet, unspectacular, the simple cessation of biological processes that occurs billions of times, that ends every life regardless of whether that life belonged to a peasant or a genius. He was buried in the chapel of Saint Hubert at the Château d'Amboise, a small but elegant structure where the French kings sometimes attended Mass. The funeral was well attended, with members of the royal household and local clergy participating, acknowledging Leonardo's status as a significant figure worthy of respect. But there was no sense at that moment that one of the greatest minds in human history had just died, that the world had lost someone whose influence would echo across centuries. Leonardo was recognized as a talented artist who had produced some notable works, as an interesting character who had investigated various subjects, but his true significance, the scope of his genius, the breadth of his investigations, the revolutionary nature of his approach would not be fully appreciated for hundreds of years. The chapel where he was buried was damaged during the French Revolution, and Leonardo's bones were scattered or lost. Later attempts to recover and reinter them were based on speculation and uncertain identification. So Leonardo, who had spent his life trying to understand the physical world in all its complexity, whose anatomical investigations had mapped the human body with unprecedented precision, eventually dissolved back into the earth without even the dignity of an identified grave. The irony would perhaps have amused him that the man who had dissected so many bodies, who had studied death as a physical and biological phenomenon, who had sketched corpses with clinical precision, should end up as scattered, unidentifiable remains, indistinguishable from the general matter of the earth. But the body was never the point. Leonardo had understood that better than most. The body was a mechanism remarkable in its complexity, worthy of study and understanding, but ultimately temporary, subject to decay like everything material. What mattered was what the body had enabled: the seeing, the thinking, the creating, the understanding that Leonardo had achieved during his 7 decades of life, and that did not dissolve with his death. It lived on in the paintings he had created, in the notebooks he had filled, in the influence he had exerted on those who came after him. Melzi, faithful to the end and beyond, gathered Leonardo's papers and transported them back to Italy, to his family estate near Milan. He devoted years to trying to organize them, to extracting from the chaos of scattered notes a coherent presentation of Leonardo's ideas about painting. He managed to compile the Trattato della Pittura, treatise on painting, drawing on Leonardo's observations about art, technique, and the principles underlying visual representation. It was published in 1651, more than a century after Leonardo's death, and became influential in artistic education, transmitting some of Leonardo's insights to later generations. But most of the notebooks remained unpublished, scattered after Melzi's death among heirs who did not fully appreciate what they possessed. Some were sold to collectors, others were lost. Still others were divided and dispersed across Europe as individual sheets or small bundles. Centuries passed during which Leonardo's scientific investigations remained largely unknown, buried in private collections, written in mirror script that few could read, filled with observations that anticipated discoveries that would be credited to others who made them independently, without knowledge of Leonardo's earlier work. The tragedy was not that Leonardo died, all people die, and he had lived a reasonably long life by the standards of his era. The tragedy was that so much of what he discovered died with him, that his insights into anatomy, into optics, into mechanics and hydraulics and geology were not transmitted to the scientific community, that the revolution he might have sparked by publishing his findings never occurred. If Leonardo's anatomical drawings had been published in the 1520s instead of remaining hidden for centuries, the development of medical science might have accelerated dramatically. If his mechanical designs had been widely known, the Industrial Revolution might have begun earlier. If his optical theories had been circulated, the understanding of light and vision might have advanced more quickly. But this was not to be. Leonardo's investigations remained private, known only to the few who had access to his papers, and even they often could not decipher the mere writing or understand the significance of what they were seeing. The world moved forward without the benefit of Leonardo's insights, rediscovering through other investigators what he had already found, reinventing what he had already designed. His genius, which might have transformed his age, instead remained dormant, waiting for future centuries to excavate and appreciate it. Yet his paintings did survive, and through them, his influence continued even if his scientific work was forgotten. The Last Supper, despite its technical deterioration, remained in the refectory at Santa Maria del Grazie in Milan, studied by generations of artists who tried to understand how Leonardo had achieved such psychological complexity, such perfect perspective, such unity of composition. The painting became a model, endlessly copied and reinterpreted, its influence spreading through European art like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. The Mona Lisa passed from Leonardo's estate into the French royal collection and eventually to the Louvre, where it slowly accumulated the fame that would make it the most recognized painting in history. Artists studied it, trying to understand Leonardo's sfumato technique, his way of modeling form through infinitely subtle gradations of tone. Critics wrote about it, projecting onto that enigmatic smile their own interpretations, their own theories about what made it so compelling. And gradually, almost despite itself, the painting became iconic, representing not just Leonardo's achievement but the entire Renaissance, the whole idea of artistic genius. His other paintings, the Virgin of the Rocks, the Lady with an Ermine, the Virgin in Child with Saint Anne, the handful of other works universally attributed to him, were treasured by those who possessed them, studied by those who could access them, influential far beyond their small number. Leonardo had completed perhaps 15 paintings in his entire life, a tiny output compared to prolific contemporaries like Raphael or Titian. Yet those 15 paintings were enough to establish him as one of the supreme masters, someone whose technical abilities and aesthetic vision set standards that others could aspire to but rarely match. In France, in the years immediately following his death, Leonardo was remembered fondly by those who had known him. King Francis I spoke of him with respect and affection, telling stories about their conversations, about the old master's insights into everything from art to engineering to natural philosophy. The king kept Leonardo's paintings, which remained in the royal collection, treasured as much for their connection to the man as for their intrinsic beauty. Francis understood that he had hosted someone extraordinary, even if he could not fully grasp the extent of Leonardo's achievements or the fancies, ways in which future generations would revere him. In Italy, Leonardo's reputation was more complicated. He was recognized as a great artist, certainly, but also as someone who had left too many projects unfinished, who had frustrated patrons, who had promised more than he delivered. His scientific investigations were barely known, his notebooks hidden away, his mechanical designs existing only in private papers that few had seen. To his contemporaries, Leonardo was a talented but difficult genius, someone whose achievements were real but whose potential had never been fully realized, who had scattered his energies across too many fields instead of focusing on the painting and sculpture that were his true calling. This assessment was not entirely wrong. Leonardo had left much unfinished, had disappointed many who relied on him, had failed to publish the discoveries that might have advanced human knowledge. His genius was undeniable, but it was also fractured, diffused across so many interests that he rarely brought any single investigation to complete closure. He was, in many ways, his own worst enemy, his perfectionism making completion impossible, his curiosity leading him away from projects before they were done, his inability to focus creating a lifetime of brilliant beginnings, followed by abandoned middles. Yet there is another way to understand Leonardo's scattered approach, one that becomes clearer with historical distance. He was not just an artist who dabbled in science or a scientist who happened to paint. He was someone for whom the artificial boundaries between disciplines did not exist, who saw art and science as aspects of a unified project understanding and representing reality in all its complexity. His anatomical studies informed his painting, allowing him to depict human figures with unprecedented accuracy and life. His optical investigations shaped his technique, teaching him how light and shadow work together to create the illusion of depth and form. His mechanical designs reflected artistic sensibility, combining functional efficiency with elegant form. Leonardo was, in this sense, a model for a different kind of intelligence, one that refused to be confined by conventional categories, that moved freely between observation and creation, between analysis and synthesis, between understanding how things worked and imagining how they might be made to work differently. The Renaissance celebrated the universal man, the individual who cultivated excellence across multiple domains, and Leonardo embodied this ideal more completely than anyone else of his era. He was painter and engineer, anatomist and architect, scientist and artist, dreamer and careful observer, all of these things simultaneously, all of them aspects of a single unified vision. His last years in France, then, were not a retreat or a decline into irrelevance, but a fitting conclusion to a life lived on his own terms. He had finally found a patron who valued him for himself rather than for what he could produce, who honored his past achievements rather than demanding constant new output, who gave him security and respect and freedom to think and dream without pressure. In that peaceful manor house by the Loire, Leonardo could look back over his extraordinary life, over the distance he had traveled from the illegitimate boy in Vinci to the honored guest of the King of France, over the paintings he had created and the thousands of investigations he had pursued. In those final months, as his strength ebbed and the world he had known for so long prepared to continue without him, Leonardo must have reflected on what he had achieved and what had eluded him. He had painted faces that would be remembered for centuries, had created images of such power and subtlety that they would influence every artist who came after. He had filled thousands of pages with observations and insights that anticipated future scientific discoveries, though he could not know whether anyone would ever read them, whether his private investigations would ever contribute to public knowledge. He had designed machines that existed only on paper but contained principles that would eventually reshape the world. He had looked at everything with fresh eyes, refusing to accept inherited wisdom without testing it against observation, insisting that experience was a more reliable teacher than authority. He had also left behind a trail of unfinished work, of disappointed patrons, of projects abandoned partway through when some new question captured his attention. He had never built his great bronze horse. He had never completed most of the paintings he started. He had never organized his notebooks into the systematic treatises he imagined. He had never published his anatomical discoveries or his theories about optics or his mechanical designs. The gap between vision and execution, which had haunted him throughout his life, remained unbridged at the end. The perfection he pursued had remained always just out of reach, compelling him forward, but never allowing him the satisfaction of arrival. Yet perhaps this too was appropriate, even necessary. A man who felt he had completed everything, who believed he had achieved all that was possible, would have stopped investigating, stopped questioning, stopped pushing at the boundaries of knowledge. Leonardo's dissatisfaction, his perpetual sense that more remained to be discovered, kept him engaged until the very end. Even as his body failed, his mind remained active, curious, eager to understand. The unfinished quality of his work was not failure but fidelity to a vision that could not be contained by any single lifetime, that pointed toward possibilities extending beyond what one person could achieve. In the garden outside his window, spring was reaching its fullness. Flowers bloomed, trees leafed out, birds built nests and raised young, the endless cycle of life continuing as it had for millions of years before humans existed and would continue for millions of years after. Leonardo had studied this cycle, had tried to understand its mechanisms, had seen in it patterns and principles that revealed the underlying order of nature. He had painted plants and animals with scientific accuracy, had dissected them to understand their internal structure, had marveled at the complexity and elegance of biological systems. Now he was returning to that cycle himself, his body preparing to decompose and return its elements to the earth, to be recycled into new forms, new life. There is no record of his final words, no deathbed pronouncement preserved for posterity. Perhaps he said nothing profound, or perhaps what he said was not recorded, or perhaps in those final moments, words seemed inadequate to what he was experiencing. He had spent his life trying to capture reality in paint and ink, to translate the three-dimensional, moving, infinitely complex world into two-dimensional representations that could convey some fraction of that complexity. Now he faced the ultimate reality, the one that no amount of observation or analysis could fully illuminate. The transition from being to non-being, from consciousness to whatever lay beyond. Melzi, sitting beside his master's bed, holding perhaps his hand, watching the breathing become shallower, the intervals between breaths growing longer, witnessing the moment when the breathing stopped and the body became still. Melzi was losing the person who had been his teacher, his mentor, his surrogate father, the center of his world for more than a decade. The grief he expressed in his letter to Leonardo's half-brothers was genuine and deep. The loss of someone irreplaceable, someone whose presence had illuminated his life and whose absence would leave a void nothing could fill. But Melzi also understood his responsibility. Leonardo had entrusted him with the notebooks, with the accumulated work of a lifetime, with ideas and discoveries that the world had not yet seen or appreciated. It was now Melzi's task to preserve these materials, to try to make sense of them, to ensure that Leonardo's legacy would extend beyond the paintings into the broader realm of human knowledge. It was a daunting responsibility, one that would occupy Melzi for the rest of his own life. And even his dedicated efforts would not be enough to prevent the eventual scattering and loss of much of what Leonardo had created. A funeral procession wound through the streets of Amboise, accompanied by members of the church and representatives of the royal household. The coffin was carried to the chapel of St. Hubert, where it was interred with appropriate ceremony and honor. A marker noted the resting place of Leonardo da Vinci, painter and engineer, honored guest of King Francis I, though the inscription could not capture the breadth of what was being buried, not just a man, but an entire universe of observation and insight, curiosity and vision, accumulated knowledge and unfulfilled dreams. The world continued, as worlds do, Francis I continued his reign, fighting wars, patronizing artists, building chateaux, governing France with energy and ambition. Melzi returned to Italy with Leonardo's papers, beginning the work of organizing them. Salai went his own way, living off the paintings and property Leonardo had left him, dying himself in 1524 in circumstances that remain unclear. The students and assistants who had learned from Leonardo carried forward what he had taught them, influencing their own students, creating chains of transmission that spread Leonardo's techniques and approaches through European art. But the man himself was gone. His particular combination of talents and interests and genius dissolved. No one would again look at the world quite the way Leonardo had, would see the same connections between art and science, between observation and creation, between the specific detail and the universal principle. He had been unique, a confluence of abilities and circumstances that could not be replicated or replaced. The Renaissance produced many great artists and thinkers, but only one Leonardo. In the centuries that followed, his reputation would grow rather than diminish, as more of his work was rediscovered and understood, as his notebooks were finally published and studied, as people began to grasp the extraordinary breadth of his investigations and the prescience of his insights. He would be recognized not just as a great artist, but as a pioneer of modern science, as someone who had demonstrated that careful observation combined with mathematical reasoning could unlock nature's secrets. He would be celebrated as the embodiment of Renaissance ideals, the universal genius who excelled in everything he attempted. He would become, in many ways, more famous in death than he had been in life, his legend growing until it sometimes obscured the complicated, difficult, brilliant human being who had actually lived. But in May of 1519, as spring turned toward summer in the Loire Valley, as the gardens bloomed and the river flowed and life continued its ancient patterns, none of this was yet apparent. There was only the absence, the silence where Leonardo's voice had been, the empty chair where he had sat, the unfinished work he had left behind. Melzi packed the notebooks carefully, preparing to transport them back to Italy. The paintings remained where Leonardo had left them, and in the chapel at Ambas, a body returned to the earth it had come from, completing the cycle that Leonardo had observed in countless other lives, but had finally, inevitably, reached himself. Chapter 7. The Legacy That Never Sleeps. Death is supposed to be an ending, the final punctuation mark on a life sentence. But for Leonardo da Vinci, death on May 2, 1519, was more like a comma, a pause before his influence spread further and deeper than it ever had during his lifetime. The man was gone, his restless mind finally stilled, his questioning voice silenced. But the works remained, the paintings that would be studied for centuries, the notebooks that would eventually reveal their secrets, the ideas that would take root in minds not yet born, the legacy that would grow rather than fade, that would speak across the years with increasing rather than diminishing authority. In the immediate aftermath of his death, Leonardo's estate was divided according to his will. Francesco Melzi took possession of the notebooks and manuscripts, recognizing them as treasures, even if their full value was not yet apparent. He transported them carefully back to Italy, to his family's villa at Vaprio d'Adda, where he devoted years to organizing them, to extracting coherent treatises from the chaos of scattered observations. It was painstaking work, complicated by Leonardo's mirror writing, by his habit of jumping between subjects without transition, by the sheer volume of material, thousands of pages covering everything from anatomy to zoology, from painting techniques to urban planning, from the flight of birds to the flow of water. Melzi managed to compile a treatise on painting, drawing together Leonardo's observations about color, light, shadow, composition, perspective, all the technical and philosophical aspects of creating art. But this represented only a tiny fraction of the notebook's content, and even this partial work would not be published for more than a century after Leonardo's death. The rest remained in manuscript form, accessible only to those who could visit Melzi's villa, who could read Italian mirror script, who had the knowledge to understand what they were seeing. It was a vast repository of genius, locked away from the world that might have benefited from it. The paintings, at least, were visible. The Last Supper, despite beginning to deteriorate even during Leonardo's lifetime due to his experimental technique, remained in the refectory at Santa Maria del Grazie in Milan. Artists traveled from across Europe to study it, to sketch copies of it, to try to understand how Leonardo had achieved such powerful effects. The composition became canonical. The way artists depicted the Last Supper for generations afterward was influenced by Leonardo's arrangement of the apostles in groups, by his use of perspective to focus attention on Christ, by his psychological approach to narrative that made each figure an individual rather than a type. The Mona Lisa remained in the French royal collection, admired by those with access to it but not yet famous in the way it would become. It was one painting among many in the king's possession, recognized as extraordinary by those who understood art, but not yet elevated into something approaching sacred status. The painting was simply itself, a small wooden panel with a woman's face on it, oil paint applied with extraordinary subtlety, a technical achievement and an aesthetic success, but not yet the icon it would become. Leonardo's other paintings were scattered, some in Italy, a few in France, others in private collections where they were cherished by owners who recognized their value. Together, these 15 or so completed paintings represented Leonardo's artistic legacy, the tangible evidence of what he could achieve when he actually finished something. They were enough to establish his reputation as one of the supreme masters of Renaissance art, someone whose work set standards that others could admire but rarely equal. But they were only a fraction of what he might have produced if he had been able to focus solely on painting, if his mind had not been constantly drawn to other questions, other investigations, other problems that seemed more urgent than completing the next commission. In the decades after Leonardo's death, his influence on art was immediate and profound. The generation of artists who came after him, the ones who had seen his work, studied his techniques, tried to understand his methods, carried forward his innovations. The sfumato that made his figures seem to emerge from shadow rather than being outlined in hard edges became a standard technique. His approach to composition, with its careful balance of elements and its psychological depth, influenced how other artists structured their own works. His understanding of anatomy, visible in every figure he painted, raised the bar for what was considered acceptable in depicting the human form. But his scientific work remained largely hidden, known only to the few who had access to his manuscripts. And so, while his artistic legacy spread immediately, his contributions to science had to wait, had to remain dormant until future generations would rediscover them and recognize what he had achieved. The anatomical drawings that showed the human body with unprecedented accuracy, the mechanical designs that anticipated modern inventions, the geological observations that understood processes taking millions of years, the optical theories that explained how vision worked, All of this remained buried in notebooks scattered across private collections, unknown to the scientists and engineers who were laying the foundations of the modern world. This delay, this gap between creation and recognition, meant that Leonardo's scientific insights had little direct impact on the scientific revolution that was beginning to unfold in the 16th and 17th centuries. Copernicus and Galileo, Harvey and Newton, Descartes and Leibniz, all the great figures who transformed how humans understood the natural world, did their work without knowledge of Leonardo's investigations. They rediscovered what he had already found, reinvented what he had already designed, arrived independently at conclusions he had reached decades or centuries earlier. Leonardo's genius was private rather than public, influential in art but isolated in science, a might have been rather than a foundation that others built upon. Yet, even in obscurity, the notebooks exerted some influence. Melzi showed them to visitors, allowed artists and scholars to examine them, answered questions about Leonardo's methods and ideas. Some of Leonardo's students and assistants had learned from him directly, had absorbed his approaches to observation and investigation, and they passed on what they knew to others. Knowledge leaked slowly out of the notebooks, spreading through informal networks, influencing individual artists and thinkers who then influenced others, creating ripples that spread outward even if the source remained hidden. After Melzi's death in 1570, more than 50 years after Leonardo's passing, the notebook's fate became precarious. Melzi's son, who lacked his father's appreciation for their value, allowed them to be scattered. Some were sold, others were given away. Still others were stolen by visitors who recognized treasures when they saw them. The collection that Leonardo had accumulated over a lifetime, that Melzi had preserved with such care, was broken apart and dispersed across Europe like seeds scattered by a strong wind. Some landed in fertile ground libraries and collections where they were preserved and eventually studied. Others were lost entirely, destroyed by time or accident or simple neglect, their insights vanishing as though they had never existed. The sculptor Pompeo Leone acquired a substantial portion of the manuscripts in the late 16th century. He attempted to organize them, but his method was destructive. He cut apart individual sheets, rearranged them by subject without regard for Leonardo's original organization, mounted them in albums that destroyed their integrity as notebooks. He meant well, thought he was making them more accessible, but he damaged them in ways that made understanding Leonardo's thought process more difficult. The notebooks had been organic documents, with ideas flowing from one subject to another, connections emerging through juxtaposition. Leone's reorganization severed these connections, creating artificial categories that did not reflect how Leonardo's mind actually worked. Yet even in this damaged state, the notebooks began to find their way into major collections. Some went to the Ambrosiana Library in Milan, others to the Royal Collection in England, still others to the Bibliothèque de l'Institut de France in Paris, and finally, after centuries of obscurity, scholars began to examine them seriously, to transcribe the mirror writing, to attempt to understand what Leonardo had been investigating. The process was slow. Leonardo's handwriting was difficult to read. His Italian was idiosyncratic. His habit of moving between subjects without explanation made interpretation challenging. But gradually, painstakingly, his scientific work was excavated from the manuscripts and brought into the light. The 19th century witnessed a Leonardo revival, a sudden explosion of interest in both his art and his scientific investigations. Scholars published transcriptions and translations of his notebooks, making them accessible to people who could not read Italian mirror script. Artists studied his techniques with renewed intensity, trying to understand how he had achieved effects that still seemed almost magical. Scientists examined his anatomical drawings, his mechanical designs, his observations about natural phenomena, and were astonished by how much he had understood, how far ahead of his time he had been. Leonardo was rediscovered not as merely a great Renaissance artist, but as a universal genius, someone who had made contributions across multiple fields, whose insights remained relevant centuries after his death. This rediscovery transformed his reputation from significant to legendary. He was no longer just the painter of the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper, though those works alone would have secured his fame. He became a symbol of human potential, of what one mind could achieve when curiosity was unlimited and conventional boundaries were ignored. He was the Renaissance man par excellence, the embodiment of an age that believed humans could excel in everything they attempted, that refused to separate art from science or beauty from truth. Schools and universities began to teach about Leonardo not just in art classes, but in history and science courses, recognizing that his significance transcended any single discipline. The 20th century brought new technologies that allowed even deeper investigation of Leonardo's work. X-rays and infrared imaging revealed the layers beneath his paintings, showing how he had worked, what changes he had made, what techniques he had used. Conservation efforts employed modern chemistry and material science to preserve paintings that were deteriorating, to stabilize them for future generations. Computer analysis of his drawings revealed patterns and principles that earlier viewers had not fully appreciated. And as aviation and mechanical engineering advanced, Leonardo's designs for flying machines and other devices were re-evaluated, recognized as containing genuine insights even if they could not have been built with Renaissance technology. His anatomical work, when finally published in facsimile editions, stunned medical professionals. The drawings were not just accurate but beautiful, combining scientific precision with aesthetic grace in ways that no medical illustrator before or since has quite matched. Leonardo had understood the body as both mechanism and miracle, had seen its beauty while analyzing its function, had drawn organs and muscles and bones with reverence as well as rigor. Medical schools began using his drawings as teaching tools, recognizing that they captured anatomical relationships more clearly than many modern illustrations. His influence on art, already substantial, was reinforced by each new generation of artists who discovered his work and found in it inspiration and instruction. The Impressionists admired his understanding of light and atmosphere. The Surrealists were fascinated by his bizarre drawings of floods and apocalyptic visions, his ability to imagine worlds beyond the everyday. Abstract artists studied his investigations of proportion and geometry, finding in his mathematical analysis principles that could be applied to non-representational art. Leonardo seemed to speak to every era, to offer something relevant regardless of how artistic styles and interests evolved. The Mona Lisa, through a combination of artistic excellence and historical accident, ascended to a level of fame that transcended art itself. The 1911 theft, which kept it in the news for 2 years, introduced it to millions of people who had never thought much about art. Its recovery and return to the Louvre were treated as major international events, covered by newspapers worldwide, creating a narrative that transformed the painting from artwork into celebrity. And once that celebrity was established, it became self-reinforcing. People visited the Louvre to see the most famous painting in the world. and the fact that millions of people visited it confirmed its status as the most famous painting in the world. By the mid-20th century, the Mona Lisa had become something unprecedented, an image so universally recognized that it could be referenced, parodied, appropriated, and manipulated with the confidence that everyone would understand what was being invoked. Advertisers used it to sell products. Comedians used it for jokes. Political cartoonists used it for commentary. Artists created variations and parodies, Duchamp adding a mustache, Warhol reproducing it in multiple colors, countless others reimagining it in infinite ways. The painting had transcended its status as art object and become pure symbol, a cultural reference point that communicated across languages and borders, that represented Western civilization, artistic genius, mystery, beauty, fame itself. Yet this transformation into icon created its own complications. The more famous the Mona Lisa became, the harder it was to actually see it as Leonardo had created it, to look past the accumulated mythology and simply experience the painting itself. Visitors to the Louvre approached it with such weight of expectation, such preconceived ideas about what they should feel, that genuine aesthetic response became difficult. The painting was now bulletproof glass and crowd-controlled barriers, security guards, and prohibited photography, a spectacle as much as an artwork. People took selfies in front of it to prove they had been there, but few spent more than a few seconds actually looking at it, trying to understand what Leonardo had achieved, why he had spent years refining that particular arrangement of pigments on that particular wooden panel. This was the paradox of Leonardo's legacy. His work had become so famous, so universally recognized, that it was simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, reproduced endlessly but rarely truly seen, referenced constantly but seldom deeply understood. Everyone knew the Mona Lisa, but how many people actually comprehended what made it extraordinary beyond its fame? Everyone had heard of Leonardo da Vinci, but how many understood the breadth of his investigations, the depth of his insights, the revolutionary nature of his approach to knowledge? Yet perhaps this too was appropriate, even necessary. A legacy that speaks to hundreds of millions of people across centuries cannot remain pure or simple. It must evolve, must be reinterpreted by each generation, must mean different things to different people. The Mona Lisa that a romantic poet saw in the 19th century was not the same painting that Leonardo created, but it was not therefore false or invalid. It was the painting filtered through romantic sensibility, interpreted through romantic concerns, made meaningful in a romantic context. And the Mona Lisa that contemporary viewers see, mediated through social media, through mass tourism, through pop culture references, is different again, but no less real as an experience, no less significant as a cultural phenomenon. Leonardo's notebooks, too, continued to reveal new dimensions as technology and scholarship advanced. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, digital imaging allowed scholars to examine pages that were too fragile to handle, to enhance faded writing, to reconstruct notebooks that had been broken apart centuries earlier. Computer analysis could compare drawings across different notebooks, identifying patterns and connections that human scholars might miss. Three-dimensional modeling could take Leonardo's mechanical designs and test whether they would actually work, building virtual versions of machines he had only sketched, discovering that many were more practical than previous generations had believed. The Codex Leicester, one of the most significant surviving notebooks, focuses primarily on water, its movement, its properties, its behavior under different conditions. Bill Gates purchased it in 1994 for more than $30 million, making it the most expensive book ever sold, and subsequently made it available for digital study, allowing scholars worldwide to examine Leonardo's observations about hydrology, geology, and astronomy. The notebook demonstrated Leonardo's method at its best: patient observation recorded in text and drawing, hypotheses proposed and tested, conclusions drawn that were often remarkably accurate given his limited tools and the state of scientific knowledge in his era. His mechanical designs, when analyzed by modern engineers, revealed both brilliance and limitation. Some of his inventions were entirely practical and could have been built with Renaissance technology. His designs for canal locks, for example, were sound and were actually implemented in various forms. Others were theoretically interesting, but practically impossible given available materials and power sources. His helicopter design contained the right principle, but could not have lifted itself with human power alone. His tank design was too heavy for its internal human-powered drive system. Yet even the impractical designs showed Leonardo asking the right questions, identifying the problems that would need to be solved, pointing toward solutions that later inventors would achieve with better technology. The revival of interest in Leonardo coincided with broader cultural changes that made his interdisciplinary approach seem particularly relevant. As the 20th century progressed, the rigid boundaries between disciplines that had characterized the Victorian era began to soften. Scientists recognized that artistic sensibility could enhance scientific observation. Artists acknowledged that scientific knowledge could deepen artistic expression. The artificial separation of two cultures, the sciences and the humanities, began to seem limiting rather than natural. And Leonardo, who had never recognized any such distinction, who had moved fluidly between painting and anatomy, between engineering and sculpture, between observation and creation, became a model for this more integrated approach to knowledge. Educational institutions began to invoke Leonardo as an ideal, encouraging students to study broadly rather than narrowly, to make connections across disciplines, to refuse the premature specialization that characterized much modern education. Renaissance man became an aspirational term, suggesting someone who could think like an artist and a scientist, who could appreciate beauty and understand mechanism, who could create and analyze with equal facility. Whether most people could actually achieve this synthesis was debatable, but Leonardo provided proof that it was at least possible, that one human mind could encompass both art and science, both aesthetics and analysis. His influence extended into unexpected areas. Computer scientists and artificial intelligence researchers studied his notebooks, looking for insights into how creative thinking worked, how innovation emerged from the combination of observation and imagination. Designers in multiple fields, from fashion to architecture to industrial design, examined his approach to form and function. His insistence that beauty and utility should not be separated. Environmental scientists appreciated his understanding of natural systems, his recognition that water and air and geological processes were interconnected, that changes in one area would affect others. Leonardo, dead for 5 centuries, remained relevant in the 21st century, continued to have things to teach about observation, investigation, creation, and the integration of knowledge. The cities associated with him, Florence, Milan, Rome, Amboise, preserved and celebrated their Leonardo heritage, maintaining museums and exhibitions devoted to his work, creating tourist industries around his memory. The house at Clos-Luz in France became a museum showing reconstructions of his inventions, allowing visitors to see 3-dimensional versions of his designs, to understand his mechanical thinking in tangible form. In Florence, the Uffizi and other museums displayed his paintings and drawings. contextualizing them within the broader Renaissance, but also highlighting their uniqueness. The ways Leonardo exceeded even the high standards of his extraordinary era. Academic conferences and scholarly journals devoted to Leonardo studies proliferated, creating a small industry of Leonardo scholarship. Experts debated attributions, trying to determine which paintings were entirely by Leonardo's hand and which involved assistance. They analyzed his techniques using scientific instruments, discovering how he had mixed pigments, how he had built up layers, how he had achieved effects that still seemed almost magical. They traced his influence on other artists, mapping networks of transmission, identifying who had learned from him directly and who had absorbed his innovations through copies and descriptions. Leonardo's studies became its own subdiscipline, with specialists devoting entire careers to understanding this one man and his impact on history. Yet, for all the scholarly attention, for all the analysis and interpretation, something essential about Leonardo remained elusive, mysterious, resistant to complete understanding. His notebooks revealed his investigations, but not always his motivations. His paintings demonstrated his technique, but not entirely his process. The man himself, his inner life, his emotional landscape, his private thoughts and feelings remained largely hidden behind the public record of his achievements. He had been, even in life, somewhat enigmatic, keeping himself at a distance from others, revealing himself through his work rather than through personal confession or intimate relationship. And that distance persisted across the centuries, making him simultaneously familiar and unknowable, present through his creations, but absent as a complete human being. Biographers attempted to fill the gaps, to construct narratives that would explain Leonardo, that would make sense of his contradictions, the brilliant artist who left most paintings unfinished, the innovative scientist who never published his discoveries, the practical engineer who designed fantastical machines that could not be built, the man who inspired devotion in students but seemed never to form lasting intimate partnerships. Each biography reflected its own era's concerns and assumptions, seeing Leonardo through contemporary lenses, emphasizing aspects that seemed most relevant to the time in which it was written. Victorian biographers saw him as a tragic figure, a genius frustrated by inadequate patronage and the limitations of his era, someone who would have achieved so much more if only circumstances had been better. Freudian psychoanalytic approaches in the early 20th century focused on his childhood, on his illegitimate birth and complex family relationships, trying to explain his art and his personality through psychological theories that now seem dated and speculative. Mid-20th century biographers emphasized his scientific achievements, positioning him as a proto-modern scientist trapped in a pre-scientific age. More recent scholarship has explored his sexuality, his possible relationships with male students and assistants, trying to understand how his personal life might have influenced his work. All these approaches had validity, all captured some aspect of Leonardo's reality. But none could fully encompass him, could reduce his complexity to a single explanatory framework. He remained larger than any interpretation, exceeding the boundaries that biographers tried to draw around him. This resistance to definitive explanation was itself part of his legacy. His final mystery, the genius whose work we can analyze endlessly, but whose essence remains just beyond our grasp. Present but elusive, like the smile on the Mona Lisa's face that seems to shift depending on how you look at it. In the digital age, Leonardo's legacy entered a new phase. His works were scanned in ultra-high resolution, allowing people anywhere in the world to examine details that would be invisible, even to someone standing directly in front of the original painting. Virtual reality reconstructions allowed viewers to step into his paintings, to experience them from impossible angles, to see them in ways Leonardo never intended, but that revealed new dimensions of his achievement. His notebooks were digitized and made searchable, allowing scholars to find every mention of a particular subject across thousands of pages, to trace the development of his ideas over decades, to map connections that would have taken years to discover through manual examination. Artificial intelligence and machine learning were applied to Leonardo's work, analyzing his drawing style with mathematical precision, attempting to distinguish his hand from those of assistants and followers, even generating new Leonardo drawings based on statistical analysis of his techniques. These applications raised philosophical questions. If a computer could replicate Leonardo's style convincingly, what did that say about artistic genius? If algorithms could analyze his techniques and explain his effects, did that diminish the sense of mystery and magic that had always surrounded his work? Or did it simply reveal new layers of complexity, new depths to be explored? The commercial exploitation of Leonardo's image and work accelerated in the modern era. His paintings appeared on everything from coffee mugs to t-shirts to shower curtains, their sacred status as high art no impediment to mass-market reproduction. Museums licensed his images for products sold in their gift shops, generating revenue that supported conservation and education, but also contributing to the commodification of culture, the transformation of art into merchandise. Leonardo's face, or rather, the presumed self-portrait that might or might not actually depict him, became a logo, a brand, instantly recognizable and marketable. Yet somehow, through all this reproduction and commercialization, through all the analysis and interpretation, through all the ways his legacy was used and misused, something genuine persisted. People still stood before the Mona Lisa, even in crowds, even surrounded by clicking phones and jostling tourists, and felt something, a connection across centuries, a recognition of shared humanity, a sense that this painted face somehow captured something essential about being alive, about being conscious, about the mystery of existing as a thinking, feeling creature in a vast and indifferent universe. The painting still worked, still communicated, still justified the reputation that had accrued to it over 5 centuries. His notebooks still inspired, still taught, still demonstrated that careful observation combined with creative thinking could unlock understanding, could reveal patterns and principles, could transform how we see the world. Artists still studied his techniques, trying to achieve the sfumato that made his figures seem to breathe, the anatomical accuracy that gave them presence, the compositional balance that made everything seem inevitable. Scientists still marveled at his investigations, at how much he had understood with such limited tools, at how many modern discoveries he had anticipated, at how relevant his approach to investigation remained even in an age of electron microscopes and computer modeling. Teachers invoked Leonardo as an example of what education should cultivate, not narrow expertise but broad curiosity, not specialized skill but integrated understanding, not the ability to answer questions but the willingness to ask them. Students wrote essays about him, drew inspiration from his life, saw in his example permission to refuse artificial boundaries, to insist that interests in art and science, in beauty and mechanism, in creativity and analysis were not contradictory but complementary. Leonardo's legacy had become, in some sense, a challenge, not just to admire what he had achieved, but to emulate his approach, to look at the world with his combination of wonder and rigor, to refuse to accept conventional wisdom without testing it against observation. His influence even extended beyond Earth. when NASA designed the Mars helicopter Ingenuity, the first aircraft to achieve powered flight on another planet. The team included a small piece of fabric from the Wright brothers' first airplane, and the Wright brothers themselves had been inspired by studying bird flight and early aviation pioneers who had built on Leonardo's investigations. The chain of inspiration stretched from Renaissance Florence to the surface of Mars, from Leonardo's sketches of flying machines to a solar-powered helicopter navigating the thin Martian atmosphere, demonstrating that ideas, once released into the world, could propagate in unexpected directions, could influence events and achievements centuries removed from their origin. In the 21st century, as humanity faced challenges that Leonardo could never have imagined, climate change, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, space exploration, his approach to knowledge remained strikingly relevant. He had insisted on understanding systems holistically, on seeing connections between different phenomena, on recognizing that changes in one area would ripple through others. This systems thinking, which he applied to water and anatomy and mechanical design, was exactly what contemporary science required to address complex, interconnected problems that could not be solved through narrow specialization alone. His reverence for nature, visible in every page of his notebooks, in every landscape background of his paintings, resonated in an age increasingly aware of environmental fragility. Leonardo had seen the Earth as a living system, with water as its blood, wind as its breath, geological processes as its metabolism. He understood that human actions could disrupt natural systems, that building in one place could cause flooding in another, that deforestation could lead to erosion and changed weather patterns. These insights, recorded 500 years before the term ecology was coined, spoke directly to contemporary environmental concerns, suggested that the wisdom needed to address current challenges might be found by looking backward as well as forward. The question of what constituted Leonardo's ultimate legacy became increasingly complex as the distance from his life increased. Was it the paintings, those 15 or so completed works that demonstrated the absolute peak of what oil painting could achieve, that set standards no one had yet exceeded? Was it the notebooks, those thousands of pages filled with observations and designs that anticipated so much of modern science and technology? Was it his approach, the integration of art and science, the insistence on observation over authority, the refusal to accept conventional boundaries? Or was it something less tangible, the example of a life lived in pursuit of understanding, the demonstration that one human mind, properly applied, could range across all of knowledge and make contributions in multiple domains? Perhaps the answer was all of these things and more. Leonardo's legacy was not a single achievement, but an entire way of being in the world, a model of what it meant to be fully human, fully engaged, fully alive to the complexity and beauty of existence. He had looked at everything with fresh eyes, had refused to accept that any question was unworthy of investigation, had insisted that understanding required both analysis and synthesis, both taking things apart to see how they worked and putting them together to see how they functioned as wholes. In museums and galleries around the world, visitors still lined up to see his paintings, still stood before them with expressions of wonder and reverence, still tried to understand what made them special beyond their fame. In libraries and research institutions, scholars still pored over his notebooks, still discovered new details and insights, still published papers analyzing particular drawings or passages, contributing to an ever-growing body of Leonardo studies that showed no signs of exhausting its subject. In classrooms and studios, teachers still used Leonardo as an example, still encouraged students to look at his work, to learn from his methods, to emulate his curiosity and rigor. The irony was that Leonardo himself would probably have been baffled by his posthumous fame, by the way his image and work had become sacred relics, by the reverence accorded to paintings he had often considered unfinished, by the scholarly attention devoted to notebooks he had filled carelessly, following his thoughts wherever they led without concern for organization or eventual publication. He had been, in his own estimation, simply trying to understand how things worked, trying to create images that captured what he saw, trying to solve problems that interested him. The fact that this had made him immortal, that his name would be known 5 centuries after his death, that his face would be recognized by billions of people, this would likely have seemed strange, perhaps even slightly absurd. Yet perhaps he would also have been gratified, would have appreciated that his investigations had eventually found an audience, that his insights had contributed to human knowledge, even if the contribution was delayed by centuries, that his belief in observation and experience over inherited authority had become foundational to modern science. He had worked mostly in isolation, without the community of fellow investigators that make science a collective enterprise. But through his notebooks, belatedly discovered and studied, he had eventually joined that community, had added his voice to the great conversation about how the world works, had demonstrated that careful attention to nature could reveal truths that libraries full of ancient texts had missed. The legacy continued to evolve, continued to accumulate new meanings and associations, continued to speak to new generations who found in Leonardo something relevant to their own concerns and challenges. He had become, in a sense, immortal, not in the religious sense he might have hoped for in his final days, but in the secular immortality of lasting influence, of ideas and images that continued to matter long after their creator had returned to dust. The paintings remained, carefully preserved and protected, still capable of moving viewers despite the barriers of time and changing aesthetic sensibilities. The notebooks remained, still yielding insights to those who studied them carefully, still demonstrating the power of patient observation and creative thinking. And perhaps most importantly, the example remained, the example of a life lived in pursuit of understanding, in service of beauty and truth, in defiance of conventional boundaries and easy categories. Leonardo had been neither purely artist nor purely scientist, but something that transcended both, something that contemporary language struggled to name. He had demonstrated that the artificial separation of disciplines was just that, artificial, a convenience of organization that did not reflect the underlying unity of knowledge, the way everything connected to everything else, the single reality that different methods of investigation approached from different angles. In the end, Leonardo's legacy was not so much what he had created as what he had shown was possible. He had proven that one person, starting with nothing but curiosity and careful attention, could make genuine contributions to human understanding, could create works that would endure for centuries, could leave the world different and better than they found it. He had shown that being illegitimate, being self-taught, being unlettered, as he called himself, being outside the formal structures of learning and authority, need not be disqualifications, but could even be advantages, allowing fresh perspectives, unconventional approaches, insights that those trained in traditional methods might miss. He had lived through war and plague, through political upheaval and personal disappointment, through the frustrations of patrons who did not appreciate his genius and the loneliness of pursuing investigations no one else cared about. He had left much unfinished, had disappointed many who relied on him, had failed by conventional measures to realize his full potential. Yet he had also created images of such power that they moved viewers 5 centuries later, had filled notebooks with insights that still taught and inspired, had lived a life of such richness and intensity that it justified itself simply in the living of it. And so, more than 500 years after his death in a manor house beside the Loire River, Leonardo da Vinci remained present in museums where his paintings hung, in libraries where his notebooks resided, in classrooms where his example was invoked, in studios where artists studied his techniques, in laboratories where scientists admired his investigations. He remained present in the Mona Lisa's enigmatic smile, in the psychological complexity of the Last Supper, in the thousands of notebook pages filled with drawings and observations. He remained present in every person who looked at the world with wonder, who refused to accept easy answers, who insisted on understanding rather than merely accepting, who saw beauty and meaning in everything from the curl of water to the structure of a smile. The legacy that never sleeps, because genius, once properly recognized, becomes part of humanity's permanent inheritance, a resource that each generation can draw upon, a demonstration of what human minds can achieve when curiosity is unlimited and the pursuit of understanding is relentless. Leonardo had given the world not just paintings and drawings, but a way of seeing, a method of investigation, an example of integrated knowledge that remained relevant regardless of how technology and culture evolved. He had shown what one life, fully lived in pursuit of truth and beauty, could accomplish. And that showing, that demonstration of possibility, was perhaps his greatest gift, his most enduring legacy, the reason his name continued to mean something, to inspire something, to call future generations toward their own pursuits of excellence and understanding. As night falls across the cities where his works reside, as security systems activate and museum doors close, as lights dim over paintings that have witnessed the passage of centuries, the legacy persists. Tomorrow, visitors will come again to stand before the Mona Lisa, to study the Last Supper, to examine notebook pages filled with mirror writing and exquisite drawings. Tomorrow, students will write papers about him, artists will try to learn from him, scientists will marvel at how much he understood. Tomorrow, the conversation will continue, the interpretation will evolve, the legacy will grow rather than diminish. Because Leonardo da Vinci, dead for more than 5 centuries, continues to teach, continues to inspire, continues to demonstrate that the human mind, properly applied, can achieve things that echo across the ages and speak truths that transcend their time. His story ends where it began, in quiet contemplation, in careful observation, in the persistent belief that understanding was possible if you looked carefully enough, thought deeply enough, refused to accept surfaces but always sought the principles beneath. From the hills of Vinci to the halls of museums worldwide, from the workshop of Verrocchio to the digital archives of the 21st century, the journey continues. The boy who watched water flow and wondered how it worked became the man who painted the Mona Lisa and designed flying machines, and became finally the legend whose name symbolizes genius itself. The legacy never sleeps because the world Leonardo showed us how to see continues to reveal its wonders to those who look with his combination of precision and poetry, analysis and awe, scientific rigor and artistic soul. And so good night, as we rest with these images and ideas. As Leonardo's life carries us toward sleep, we carry with us the understanding that genius is not just extraordinary talent, but extraordinary curiosity, not just skill, but vision, Not just the ability to see what is, but the courage to imagine what might be. In that understanding, in that inspiration, the legacy lives on, never sleeping, always present, waiting for the next person who looks at the world and asks, as Leonardo did, "How does this work? Why is it beautiful? What truth does it contain?" Those questions, asked 500 years ago in mirror script on paper, now fragile with age, remain as relevant as ever, as urgent as ever, as capable of leading to discovery and creation as ever. And in that eternal relevance lies immortality more complete than any monument, any grave, any memorial, the immortality of ideas that continue to illuminate, to guide, to inspire long after the hand that first wrote them has returned to dust. Sleep well with the genius of Leonardo watching over your dreams, his curiosity whispering through your rest, his insistence that the world is knowable and beautiful accompanying you into the gentle darkness, into the restoration that sleep provides, into the tomorrow where his legacy continues its eternal conversation with all who seek to understand, to create, to live fully in the wonder of existence.